Good afternoon and welcome to what I think is video 7C, which is the continuing story of the BBC before 1945, the BBC before 1945. And this class and this chapter and the next few will be taking a chronological approach. Now, in the history books or on the BBC website or even in an encyclopedia, you can find a detailed chronology. So I'm not looking here to repeat things which are easy to find. I'm going to focus on a selection of significant events from my point of view, and on what they mean from a historical point of view. That is to say, I will be trying to link them to some big themes, because events is events, but events isn't history. So I'm going to try to link them in some of the big themes, you know, the BBC and elitism, the BBC and women, the BBC and competition, the BBC and government control, the BBC and diversity, the BBC and modernity, the BBC and education, just to give you the main examples there. And I'd be taking the view then, which you won't be surprised, those of you who know me, that the point of that opening up questions is at least as important as answering them from a historian's point of view. So let me see if I can get onto move down to the next. Yes, there we go. I left off last time around 1928 and talking a little bit about the situation of women. So what other things happened in 1928? Well, in 1928, in January, for the first time ever, the daily service was broadcast. It was originally called a short religious service, only about 15 minutes long, but the name was changed to the daily service a few months later. A religious prayer program, 15 minutes long. The program still runs today on BBC Radio 4, making it the longest running program on British radio, and perhaps the longest running program in the world. And looking on the BBC website today, you can see that the site of the daily service, so every day a religious program, something quite interesting to think about in our country in France, where the public service is determinedly secular, although as you can see at the bottom, France Télévisions does have once a week the mass, the Catholic mass on the television. So it's not absolutely impossible to get religion on French things. We're going to move right into 1929. Right into 1929, and in 1929, in August, the BBC began testing transmissions using John Logie Baird's experimental 30-line television system, and these tests would continue for 3 years. So you had the very, very beginnings of television. Of course, there's nobody to watch it. There's only a few technicians who have these first televisions to watch. But this was the beginning of something which was going to, of course, revolutionize broadcasting in a way that people weren't expecting. And it took a long time for the BBC leadership to really take to television. Even after the Second World War, there was a period when, you know, they didn't really want to spend too much money on television. They weren't convinced it was so important. Radio had transformed the world. Television, was that really going to make much difference? They didn't know. Now, going back to 1929 and looking at the relationship of the BBC with other media, we'd already looked last time at some of the conflicts between the BBC and the newspapers. Newspapers very powerful and rather unhappy that the BBC was now going to be broadcasting news and imposing this compromise by which the BBC didn't have any journalists and simply had to read extracts from the newspapers. But if we look at other media, by 1929, we can see some of the tensions between the BBC and, for example, theatre, concert halls, and the recording industry. The BBC was complaining by 1929 that the agents of many comedians refused to sign contracts for the radio for broadcasting because the comedians feared that it would eat up their material. Of course, if you play in a variety theatre and you can fill it up with 3,000 people every night, the same set of jokes can last a long time. But if you play them on the radio, and you might have, by 1929, millions of people watching it, then it can very quickly reduce the value, quote, to reduce the value of the artist as a visible music hall performer. So there were these tensions going on. I think this has continued to be the case with comedians. There've always been, for a long time, there were comics who didn't want to be on the television. And you get the slightly the opposite effect, because some comics who are successful on the television can sometimes run a stage show and take it around the country, but they have to be really, really successful. It's really the top people like Peter Kay today who can do this. Let's have a look then at the BBC and their relationship with recording companies. Now, the record companies, that was something quite different, because they were quite happy, the record companies, to make records with bands or singers, particularly dance bands, who had already shown their power to achieve popularity by wireless. And so the record companies had this, the radio would test them out. They'd go on the radio, and if they were successful, they'd get a record contract. What about the other kind of theatre, normal straight theatre, if you like, respectable, legitimate theatre, as we say? Remember, this is still far more important than today. Before the television and before talking cinema, which was just about beginning at the end of the 1920s, the theatre was a far bigger deal than it is today. Just let me turn that down so it's not squeaking at you. And the BBC was developing then this new idea of the radio play, and by 1929 the BBC had received 6,000 manuscripts, people saying, "I'll write a play for the BBC, here it is." And as one commentator said, day in and day out, manuscripts come in and nearly all go out again through the post with a note saying, "We regret," etc. In fact, a lot of the people who sent scripts in for radio plays, in fact, were writing them for the theatre, and they didn't work on radio. But I will probably come back to that at some point. Very important event in 1929, the BBC publication The Listener was established. And The Listener would be published every week until 1991, maintaining its title, The Listener, even when television was the main medium discussed. And at the beginning, the principal things that they put in it were the script of talks which had been given on the radio. So it was very much educationally orientated, if you will. And you can see there the very first front page, principal contents. And one of the things you noticed, and the very big variety of subjects, science, arts, politics, music, but also look at who the main writers are. In fact, the people who'd given the talks on the television: Sir John Cadman, Sir Walford Davis, Sir Oliver Jobs, and Lord Ronald Shabu Kensington. It was very much reserved to the elite. This was not about getting the man next door to speak to you. Now, the 1929 is also the moment when the first report, or the first well-known report on broadcasting for schools, was published. And now one might think that one could say that wireless education, that is to say radio broadcasts made specific for schools, was the first kind of distance learning, or as we say in French, the distanciel. The very first broadcast to a school was in February 1924. That was an experiment, and it included a talk about the place of the ballad in literature, a reading in French by a professor from Glasgow University, etc. But by 1927, when the BBC became a public service, what's the word? Sorry, I'm getting confused here. But when the BBC became a public service, the Education Committee was well established. In the same year, they started publishing pamphlets to go with the broadcast. It's a very, very specific thing, this radio for schools. Remember that there is no portable recording machines, and therefore you have to get the children into the classroom at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, the time when the radio program was coming out, and this will continue for a long time. When I was young, because I'm very old, when I was young, they would play television in the schools, and this was the TV broadcast, the science program at 11 o'clock on Thursday, and you had to get everybody, and then the teacher would wheel in the school television. Maybe they had two, but, and so these are really very interesting and influential, but they did have some problems because some teachers and indeed some local education authorities, who were the organizations which run the education system, were rather unhappy about the BBC interfering in what they saw as a teacher's domain. And so the BBC had to be very diplomatic and said, oh, well, yes, these broadcasts are not to replace lessons. Oh, no. They're just to supplement the school curriculum. And so when this report came out on schools in Kent, the BBC took notice of the opinions of teachers and made significant changes. So less lecturing, more involving teachers, and also they began visiting teacher training colleges to work with trainee teachers about how to use broadcasting. So we're moving into the 1920s now, and of course the 1930s now, and of course the 1930s begins in a social manner with the Wall Street crash, this terrible stock market crash in 1929, and the collapse of economies around the world, mass unemployment, millions and millions of people unemployment, mass poverty. And in Britain, the 1930s was also marked at the beginning, well, in 1929, by the election of the first Labour government, the first majority Labour government. They had had a minority government in 1924, and the first majority Labour government in 1929, under the leadership of Ramsay MacDonald, is universally considered in the Labour Party as being absolutely a disaster, because they managed to get to the elected Prime Minister this socialist hero. And the result was that he, 2 years later, under the pressure of the crisis, formed a new government, mostly made up of Conservatives, and was expelled from his own party. And this new government, the national government, went into very deep cuts in social budgets and in help for unemployed and so on. So there was a very, very high level of social tension, to such an extent that in 1931 in Scotland, there was a mutiny. 1,000 sailors in the British Atlantic fleet went on strike. And when members of the army and the navy go on strike, this is a very big deal. And this could have been a symbol for what was going to be a decade of extremes. 1933 was described by the great novelist Victor Serge as midnight in the century. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor in Germany, while Stalin set about executing all the surviving leaders of the 1917 revolution. In Britain, too, extremes were very much present. Fascism had many supporters. Oswald Mosley of the British Union Fascists held mass meetings around the country, and in 1936 decided to organise a fascist march through the Jewish part of London in Cable Street, which was stopped by an alliance of local Jews and trade unionists and communists, which demoralised the fascist party. But it was very much an extreme situation. Meanwhile, the British government was trying hard to avoid a war with Hitler, partly because a section of the elite quite sympathised with him, and partly because they were unsure about whether the population would accept a new massive war only 20 years after the previous one. So meanwhile, what was happening at the BBC? It was quite a strict regime at this time. There's quite a lot of censorship going on, and also a very, let's say, traditionalist, very narrow view of what was appropriate for radio. And so, as Raymond Postgate says, they were expected not to shock any older people listening, not to shock any members of the clergy. And until 1928, they were suspected to avoid quoting from the Bible, talking about alcohol, being vulgar, or talking about politics. This is when they were in the entertainment programs. Popular foreign music was excluded from programs and replaced with British alternatives. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister decided in 1928, very clearly decided that censorship should continue on editorial opinions on public policy. However, for the first time, they did allow the BBC to have a wider subject matter and to deal with some questions which were controversial. And this led to the establishment of a political talk series, which were established on the BBC, but carefully monitored, and this did lead to some censorship. For example, Oswald Mosley, the fascist leader, and Harry Pollitt, a leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain. There was a moment, this is 1935, there was a moment of tension because the BBC had signed a contract with these two people, Mosley and Pollitt separately, they weren't together at all, to provide a series of 5 programmes on their party's policies. However, the foreign minister first of all suspended and then cancelled this program, and so that was an extreme example. But less radical politicians could also face similar censorship. Still in 1929, you can see here the posters of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party for the election. 1930 saw the first ever television drama production. A play entitled The Man with the Flower in His Mouth. You can find it on YouTube, and this is written by Luigi Pirandello, the guy who wrote Sea, Personaggi and several other things. And so that was a moment, although the quality was limited. As you can see, there's the photograph of the actor on the left and the result on the screen on the right. Although it's what we consider today to be extremely poor quality, it was magic at the time because the few people who had televisions, very, very few people had televisions, I mean, mostly technicians, could see something which was happening at the same time many miles away, and this appeared to be magic to them, of course. But radio was still very, very much a force to be reckoned with, and by September 1930, there were 12 million radio licenses. That is to say, half the households in the country. 1931 saw the first live outside broadcast, which was at the famous horse race, the Derby. There had been previous sports reporting, but it had not been live. What else do we have here? Yes, the next event from the 1930s, but beginning in 1931, continuing for several years, quite a number of years, was the story of Radio Normandie. Radio Normandie was that one. The BBC came to face with a particular problem, and that was, it's all very well for the government to say, okay, the BBC has a monopoly on broadcasting in Britain. Nobody else is allowed to broadcast in Britain. But the thing is that radio waves do not stop. Just like the clouds from Chernobyl, they do not stop at the border of a country. And so it was perfectly possible for stations established in France to broadcast in English for English listeners. And they did this, and most famously, Radio Normandie, which set up, I think, in 1931, or at least that's when the English programs began, under the leadership of Captain Plug, Leonard Plug. Fascinating story, really. So what they did is that the English people involved bought time on the French radio station, and from midnight to 3 a.m. they would broadcast in English for listeners in England. And this was a very different style from the rather staid, although worthy and educational BBC. It was 90% dance music, foxtrots, etc. Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries was one of the hits of the time, and they were also playing music hall and so on, and marching ahead under the slogan or under the approach, give the people what they want. A very complicated expression, really, but we'll come back to that. And they had a much more chirpy style, and indeed this is represented by the story of a presenter who had worked for one of the other commercial radios of the 30s. There was Radio Normandie, also Radio Luxembourg. And one of the presenters who had worked for Radio Luxembourg was interviewed for a job by the BBC in the 1930s, and when he'd read his news item, the interviewer complained, "You were sounding much too interested in the news when you read that," because they were supposed to be really solidly neutral to the expression and to the extent of not expressing any sign of sympathy. And indeed, this is one of the excuses that was used to not allow women to read the news. because people said that women's voices are naturally too emotional. And in his autobiography, this presenter mocks the BBC a little bit, and he says, "I think the announcers had given up wearing dinner jackets by then." And it's not really a joke that the BBC news readers, although they were on the radio, really did dress very, 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 very formally. So this was a dangerous bit of competition for the BBC. Now, it wasn't direct commercial competition because the BBC didn't lose money because people were listening to Radio Normandy. There's no advertisers refusing to advertise with the BBC because the BBC didn't have advertising. But the BBC needed public money, and if it became generally known in the newspapers, in the public debate and so on, if it became generally known that a lot of the population preferred not to listen to the BBC, then the BBC would have difficulty justifying that everybody who has a wireless should pay the license fee to the BBC. So it would become a political problem if they lost popularity. Because of this, they were obliged to reconsider some traditions. For example, the tradition of the Wreath Sunday. Now, the Wreath Sunday was simply an approach to Sunday programming because Wreath was a strict Presbyterian and considered that the fact that people do not respect Sunday as a special religious day is a terrible tragedy in the modern world. Therefore, on Sunday, and you might be able to see on this example, there were no programs at the time when people might be at church. And then after that, there was no comedy and there was no popular music on a Sunday. That was 19. This is an example from 1929, but the competition with Radio Normandy was from 1931. In 1932, the BBC moves into its new building, which you can see there, which you can see behind the Broadcasting House. I think I may have missed one there. Oh, yes, and also in 1932, the opening of the Empire Service, which will later be the World Service. And here you have a little picture from 1932 of where the British Empire was. And indeed, on the 25th of December 1932, King George V became the first monarch to deliver a Christmas Day message by radio via the World Service. Another important event in 1932 is that the BBC established a marriage bar. That is to say that after 1932, if women would quite naturally be recruited to the BBC, when they were single, if they got married, they were expected to leave. Or in fact, with the marriage bar from 1932, if they got married, they were obliged to leave. Now, this seems very shocking to us today, but at the time in the 1920s was extremely common in teaching, in the civil service, in the banks, in the insurance, and so on. Based on a series of ideological and practical questions, first of all, keeping house and looking after the family was much harder at the time than it is today, and so there was a need for somebody to do an enormous amount of work at home, and the inequality between men and women decided it was going to be many women who were doing it. Secondly, there was the idea that it's a man's job to work and do overtime and bring the money home, and therefore, although a single woman might need to make money to live, a married woman was really taking work away from the men if she continued working. That was the ideology. This was accepted by most men and most women at the time, because that's how ideology works. But nevertheless, there was quite a bit of opposition. There have been a series of trade union campaigns and women's movement campaigns against the what's the word? Against the practice. Okay, so there I've got as far as the marriage bar. Let me get back there. Got as far as the marriage bar. Yes. So when you think of, well, why did the BBC establish a marriage bar? In fact, the correct question might be, why was there no marriage bar before 1932? And it's really because the BBC was a modern, avant-garde, new industry, and so was progressive in the way that it dealt with its staff. But as 1932 came along, the BBC was getting much, much bigger and becoming much more part of the establishment, and therefore, through this sort of conformism, they moved into the way that big companies did them. Now, it was interesting, but so in any case, by 1932, they had 400 of the 1,300 employees were women. And the BBC then decided to introduce this marriage bar, but they were rather frightened of women's groups campaigning against it. They decided to do it anyway, but noticed that they announced it to all their staff, but the rule was only written down 9 months later. Also, interestingly enough, cleaners were not included. You could be married if you were a cleaner, but not if you were a presenter or an engineer or a manager. It reminds me of the French railway company, where you can't work if you wear a Muslim headscarf, except if you're a cleaner. So that was the institution of the marriage bar. There were discontinued until the war. Now, there were a number of campaigns against it, and indeed secret marriages were not rare. That is to say that women sometimes got married and kept it a secret, which was quite difficult in the 1930s. And this poster that I show you is an example of a victory in another area for London teachers, where they won the removal of the marriage bar for London teachers. Okay, well, I will be continuing very shortly, but that's all for this particular chapter. Thank you for listening.